Hello and welcome to Behind the Story with America Media. Today we're talking about COP26, the Global Climate Summit taking place in Glasgow, and we're looking at it from a Catholic perspective with a Jesuit priest from South Africa. Pope Francis has been very outspoken about the importance of this meeting and coming together as a human family to fight climate change and mitigate, as much as possible, this catastrophic ecological crisis. If you value this kind of conversation from America, be sure to hit the subscribe button and share the video. And please consider supporting our ministry. The best way to do that is to get a digital subscription to America Magazine at americamagazine.org/subscribe. The link is below. Peter Knox is a Jesuit from South Africa. Since 2013, he has taught systematic theology, Christian ethics, and the environment at the Jesuit School of Theology at Hekima University College in Nairobi. He has served as a local expert on 4 delegations for the Holy See's representation at the United Nations in Nairobi. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
It's a great pleasure, Sebastian. Pleasure to be with you.
Let's just start with the very basics. We're going into COP26 in Glasgow. What are these COP meetings? Who is there? What's the point of them?
A COP is an acronym for a conference of the parties, and the parties are those countries, mostly countries, but there's also the European Union, which have signed up to various conventions of the United Nations. So this conference of the parties takes place normally every year when we're talking about the Convention on Climate Change. This takes place every year, and so this is the 26th conference of the parties since the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change was first signed after the Rio meeting in the 1990s. So it's been going every year. Every year the parties sign, they come and discuss more about their commitments and how their commitments are going to climate change or avoiding climate change.
So they've been going on since the 90s, as you mentioned. I think most observers, most ordinary people around the world only hear about the very big ones. We were talking beforehand about Kyoto in the 90s. It was a very significant landmark convention. And then most recently, Paris in 2015, COP21, which was groundbreaking because there was an agreement that was signed by the countries and the parties who were there, making a commitment to try to keep global temperature rises below 2.0 degrees Celsius, right? So that was sort of unique, I think, about the Paris climate meeting. Is there something like that around this summit in Glasgow? Is there a goal or a target or something very practical that we're looking to come out of this one?
Well, I mean, what the president of the COP has in mind is that he's trying to get security and to make sure that people will stick to the 1.5 degree target. That's 1.5 degrees of heating, global heating, since the beginning of the industrial age. So we're trying to keep to the Paris Agreement. There are ways, the president wants to talk about adapting ways to protect communities and to protect natural habitats. The president wants to get more finance mobilized. At Paris, the parties committed themselves to producing $100 billion per year for climate financing, but that hasn't been really forthcoming. We heard last month that only $80 billion was produced last year, the 2020 financial year. And so the president is trying to mobilize more financing. And then the fourth item on his agenda is to help people to work together to deliver on Paris and to put the rule book in place for Paris. Paris was a broad agreement and everybody left feeling very good. But in order to implement the Paris Agreement, there has to be a lot of rules put in place, like annual reporting and doing a great big worldwide audit of global greenhouse gases.
So it sounds like this summit is going to be very much about implementation of some of those targets that were set back in 2015. But is there also a sense of urgency here 6 years later? I mean, we've seen wildfires around the world, flooding, these extreme weather systems. We are starting to see the impacts of climate change around the world, rising sea levels. Is there an urgency around this one in Glasgow that also might be unique in some way?
Yes, I think what generated a certain amount of urgency was the publication last month of the Intergovernmental Panel's climate change report. So this is the 6th assessment since the Intergovernmental Panel started reporting on climate change. And their observations at the beginning of the report are very, very striking. They really hit us. I'm just going to quote there from that report. Climate change is already affecting every inhabited region across the globe, with human influence contributing to many observed changes in weather and climate extremes. And then it lists hot extremes, heavy precipitation, and agricultural and ecological drought. The report continues, climate change is widespread, it's rapid, and it's intensifying. And Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said that this report is a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening, the evidence is irrefutable, greenhouse gases from human causes are causing the climate to change. So Guterres has really put the urgency in front of everybody. Everybody knows now it's not just another talk shop. Glasgow cannot just be another big international meeting where people come and talk. There's something that they have to do and have to do very quickly. And I think that doesn't just apply to governments. I think it applies to us as ordinary citizens of our respective countries as well. We have to take that very, very technical report. We have to, and it's 1,300 pages, so nobody's going to read it really, but we have to take it seriously and say, look, this is happening already. Climate change is not something in the distant future. It's not something that our children are going to have to deal with. It's happening now. There's widespread drought and increasing drought across Africa, for example, where I live and where I've worked for all my working life. It's happening. Sea levels are rising. We had a city in Mozambique completely inundated 2 years ago by a cyclone. The city of Beira was completely inundated, and that's largely due to climate change. It's a very low-lying coastal city, and the city's pretty well been lost. And so it's happening, it's real, and it's accelerating.
You mentioned that everybody has to participate in this. We all have to do something. A person who has done a lot is Pope Francis. Obviously, the ecological crisis is a very important point of emphasis for him, for his pontificate. He issued this groundbreaking encyclical in 2015 called Laudato Si, on care for our common home, which was right before the Paris Climate Summit. And as I understand, it actually shaped some of those discussions and influenced some of those discussions in a real tangible way. But his whole approach has been to sort of lay the spiritual, moral, the religious foundation for tackling this, because this is a crisis that affects all of humanity, and that means obviously our spiritual interconnectedness and well-being as one human family. So here we are 6 years later, after the publication of Laudato Si. Francis, we'll talk a little bit more about what he's done in the lead up to the Glasgow summit, but here we are 6 years later. How do you think Francis sees his role today on the stage, on the global stage, as a religious leader in trying to kind of awaken our consciences to this crisis?
I'm very grateful for the pontificate of Francis. I'm very grateful that he's made aware, certainly to Catholics, at least to Catholics, that care for the environment is part of our Christian moral responsibility. We've had all sorts of encyclicals previously from previous popes, from previous pontificates on different issues, but Pope Francis brought this to the attention of Catholics, that care for the environment, the world that God gave us, is really important. It's part of our being Christian. It's part of our care for future generations. Pope Benedict spoke about intergenerational solidarity. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis makes intergenerational solidarity a keystone of being Christian. And in Africa, we always talk about the ones who are going to come after us. We're very important. We focus on our ancestors. We're concerned about our ancestors, but we're also concerned about our children. And I'm sure that's not uniquely African, but I mean, we really have to think of the worlds that our children are going to be living in. Pope Francis is also a focal point, I think, for many world religious leaders, both Christian and non-Christian. If we think just recently on the 4th of October, that was this month, on the Feast of St. Francis of Assisi, the end of the season of creation, Pope Francis, Archbishop Justin Welby, and the Patriarch, the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, they published a call to all Christians to take care of the environment. Pope Francis now brings religious leaders to Rome, so that was 2 weeks ago, brought religious leaders to Rome and said, let's talk about the environment in advance of the COP26. The religious leaders there, maybe 40 religious leaders, represent maybe 80%. Your American magazine says 84% of human beings on this planet. And if our religious leaders are speaking to us, to 84% of us around the world, we know that it's something really, really serious. And Pope Francis he's just been a focal point, I think, for religious leaders.
Yeah, our reporting stated that it was really an unprecedented gathering of interfaith leaders. You mentioned some of them. It was really extraordinary to see them all come together to make a common appeal, and specifically targeted toward the parties who are going to be, or the representatives of parties who are going to be at this Glasgow summit, COP26. A couple of things that they mentioned in the appeal, calling for the world to achieve net zero carbon emissions well before mid-century. This was a Paris climate summit goal. They call on richer nations to help poorer nations reduce emissions. They call for a transition to clean energy. You mentioned, collectively these people represent, this group of people that was at the Vatican represent about 80 to 84% of the world's population, which is huge. So I'm wondering, what impact do you think, an appeal like this could have on the discussion?
I somehow suspect that many of the negotiators who are going to Glasgow in the next couple of weeks, they've already got their national points of view made up. For example, Barbara Creasy, the South African Minister of Environmental Affairs and Forestry, she's already discussed with the South African government what our position is. And so she may have the moral pressure coming from her religious leaders, but many of the governments have already decided what their positions are going to be at the COP26. That being said, there are some countries which are theocracies. If you think of Iran, for example, where their religious leader can apply a certain amount of pressure on the government. Most Western countries are no longer theocracies. The religious leaders will say something that may inform some members of the societies, but that's not going to be used to inform policy. I think policy.
The other way of looking.
Carry on.
The other way of looking at this, I thought when I saw that number of representing 80 to 84% of the world's population, is that this is a group of people that is speaking for us, for people of faith. And so suddenly there's a responsibility, as you alluded to earlier, on all of us to actually say, okay, if we're going to stand up and make very strong statements about what we need to do collectively, and and how people of faith are supportive of that, what does that mean for us? It puts a lot of responsibility on people of faith around the world. So I'm thinking, what do you think about that side of it? I mean, what could an appeal, a kind of interfaith meeting like this do for religious communities at the grassroots level? Should we be thinking about doing something collectively or more than we are right now in light of this unprecedented appeal?
I think let's go back to Laudato Si, where Pope Francis calls for each of us, each person, to have an ecological conversion. each person to start thinking of himself not as the apex and the summit of creation, but part of a much, much broader creation. None of us is kind of above anybody else, at least as human beings. We have to think of ourselves not only as not above every other human being, but not above creation as a whole. We're part of creation. We're a functioning part, a very significant part of creation. And I think that's Pope Francis's message. The other religious leaders will presumably take back a message like that to their constituencies, to their people of faith. And they'll also say, look, we're part of creation, whether we believe in that God created or whether we believe that there's a religious force in or religious dynamism in creation, whether we're Hindus or Sufis or whatever. We're part of creation, and we're not placed over above creation. Pope Francis was quite clear that the anthropocentrism, the focus on ourselves as human beings, is not in the spirit of the Gospels. It's not in the spirit of Christianity. And I think many other religions have that message already well before Western Christians have that message.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. He always, this appeal to fraternity and our interconnectedness and solidarity and seeing ourselves as one family is just coming through loud and clear. So Peter, the world was watching and I think hoping that Pope Francis would actually go to Glasgow to address the conference. I know it was his desire to do so, but we've learned recently that he will no longer be attending. Do you have thoughts on why that is?
When Pope Francis spoke with the religious leaders earlier this month, he said that he will make every effort to go to Glasgow, dependent on his health. I mean, it was conditional. That the way I read it, if I'm well enough, I would love to go to Glasgow and be there among the other world leaders. There'll be at least 100 world leaders. And we know that Pope Francis is a leader. He represents the Holy See. But he's sending his Secretary of State, the official political head of the Holy See.
And I should just add to that, in speaking with Gerard O'Connell, our Vatican correspondent here at America, to the best of his knowledge, this isn't actually related to a specific health problem, so we can't speculate about that per se. The truth is that we just don't know, and the Vatican hasn't really said why he's not going, to the best of Jerry's knowledge. So I'll just add that.
Oh, well, that's good to hear. I mean, I'd be very sorry to hear that he has specific health issues. That's good to hear that it's not related to a specific issue.
Obviously, the Pope's message and the message of the world religious leaders who were there at the Vatican, believe that we're all in this together. We know that climate change does impact the poor disproportionately, the effects of it, of course, but it is a crisis that we can't face in isolation. So what do you think? I mean, like looking at the geopolitical landscape today, what are the roadblocks to adopting that kind of perspective, that kind of fraternal perspective where we see each other as brothers and sisters?
I think I'll start with the most obvious, and that's climate change denialism. And I mean, you don't have to go very far from the United States or from your office where you are at the moment to think of President Trump and the previous President Bush, who seem to have been very strong climate change denialists. And they blocked, in my opinion, so observing from the global south, they blocked the whole ecological movement and climate restoration movement for a good number of years. So that's one barrier. George Bush's heavy investment with the oil industry, Donald Trump's commitment to the coal industry, that is unearthing fossil fuels and continuing the use of fossil fuels, has been problematic because the rest of the world and the climate change movement is saying we have to wean ourselves from fossil fuels and find cleaner sources of energy that don't generate as many greenhouse gases. We have to find, in Africa, people love meat, particularly young men will like meat. And as we know, cows generate methane. Methane is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. And we have to, in our part of the world, we have to wean ourselves from a very meat focused diet, and find other ways to nourish ourselves, which don't involve so much meat. Other blockages, there's the financial blockage, of course. I mean, many developing countries have invested in polluting sources of energy, locomotion, transport, and things like that. We have to get away from very, very greenhouse intense or carbon intense sources of energy, to find other ways of getting around, which don't require oils and coals to keep us going.
The crisis seems to be so severe now that, you know, the climate scientists and the people who are kind of, you know, sounding the alarm, including the likes of people like Pope Francis, it seems to break down the kind of typical political divides. Like you mentioned a couple of political leaders here in the United States who certainly didn't help with the crisis, but I can think of a lot of those climate activists saying that people on the other side of the aisle are also too much invested in fossil fuels, for example, and the status quo, the way the system is. So it's really a kind of a more revolutionary kind of perspective that we need to transform everything, if I'm reading the science correctly, and it seems to put the responsibility on all political leaders. I could think of even on, you know, recently here in the United States, President Obama, and now his former vice president and now President Joe Biden. And I know that they're, like, as I mentioned, there's calls to do much more even than they're doing as well. So, you know, given the state of the crisis that we're in, it seems that all political parties in the last 20, 30 years are implicated in this, are not doing enough, are not rising to the challenge that we face collectively.
That's correct. I mean, it is a matter of politics. It's a matter of party politics, and I mean, looking at Europe, there's been the Green Movement. There's been a fairly strong movement in Europe for many years. In Africa, the Green Movement and ecological politics hasn't really been significant at all. I think we have the advantage, though, that our political cycle is a lot longer than yours. Many of your elected officials don't look beyond the next, say, intermediate elections, or look beyond the next electoral cycle. That's 4 years. We have leaders in Africa who've been in power and using the power very often for their own benefit for 20 or 30 years. And so we have a much longer, at least our governments can afford to have a much longer view of what do we have to do for the good of our people, for the good of our countries. We also have this much younger population in general. So we're thinking, how are our populations going to be suffering in 20 years' time? And they'll still be talking about me as president, whoever I am. I need to do something for my people so that my legacy is significant. At least it's regarded as favorable towards the climate situation.
If part of solving this crisis is bringing, you know, political parties together here in the United States and you know, getting over our polarization, we might be in worse shape than we even imagine, because we're certainly not trending that way, but definitely a challenge. I mean, that's one of the things that the United States here is going to have to do, get over that partisanship to try to start planning some long-term political policy that will really make a difference.
Yes, I think, if I may just step in there, I think lots of young people, I mean, if you think of Greta Thunberg, for example, and the Fridays for the Climate movement, they're kind of non-partisan. At least they don't follow the normal left and right, or Democrat and conservative, or Democrat and Republican parties. Even in their own countries, they're not tied to the party politics. They're just young people saying, we're concerned about our future. And it's across the political spectrum. They're really, really worried about, and some of them suffer anxiety, major anxiety and trauma when they look at the forest fires, when they look at major climate events. And it's not about party politics. And we have to get beyond the notion that the parties are going to solve the issues. We have to come together as countries, and countries with commitment, and that will require sacrifice of all of us. I mean, I enjoy driving. I enjoy having a motor car to myself, but I really have to step out of my sort of little private vehicle and try to use more public transport. For example, my diet has to change, and there are all sorts of levels of ecological conversion that Pope Francis is calling us to. And it's not just carry on.
You mentioned Greta Thunberg, who's a very well-known kind of climate activist, and really incredible young woman, but often berated or dismissed for political reasons or ideological reasons. But it's an important point because you've done some work in the intergenerational field, and when I was looking back at the appeal that Francis and these interfaith leaders and scientists made ahead of COP26 in Glasgow, one of the things they said was, and this is a quote, "Future generations will never forgive us if we miss the opportunity to protect our common home. We have inherited a garden. We must not leave a desert to our children." There's this constant emphasis from Pope Francis and religious leaders about the intergenerational dynamic here. Obviously, we kind of know that on the surface. But can you talk to me about the importance of having that intergenerational perspective and how that connects us in ways that we really need more of today and as we face this crisis?
I think my parents' generation went through the Second World War, and I was born in the 1960s, so very shortly after the Second World War. My parents' generation did everything they could to put us, that is my generation, onto a very good economic trajectory. I've got 3 PhDs in my family. My immediate siblings, we have 3 PhDs among us. Our parents have made great sacrifices, but the planet has made great sacrifices as well. It's come at enormous cost to the planet. I'm seeing behind you, I'm not sure where it is, but it looks terribly industrial, it looks terribly dirty, and parts of South Africa are like that. South Africa is a very industrialized and a very unclean environment. And now younger people are saying, okay, that's come at a great cost, and okay, we do want jobs, we do want employment for ourselves, but are we prepared to sacrifice our planet and our children's future in order to have a certain standard of living? And I think younger people are turning towards, at least many younger people are turning towards a simpler lifestyle so that they are not going to be as heavy on the planet. And then they're thinking about the future. And every generation, I think, does consider the future, but their vision of what's a good future is changing. And that's an aesthetic change. That's a change in what people think is good or what looks good. But it's also a sense of ethics. This is a moral question now. Whereas I don't think it was regarded as so powerfully moral in my parents' generation. My parents brought me up to enjoy nature. We went hiking, we went to natural parks, we went to the ocean, we enjoyed the beauty of nature. But now it's becoming more than just an aesthetic thing, a thing about enjoying the beauty. It's becoming something about this is a world that we have to take care of for every generation that's going to follow us.
Mm-hmm. The countries or parties that are going to be present in Glasgow obviously vary in size and power and influence, and also their climate impact. I was looking at who the worst emitters of greenhouse gases are: China, the United States, India, Russia, and we often focus, because they have such a large impact, we focus on them and talk about the goals that they're setting for themselves and that they're not meeting at the pace that they need to be meeting. But I know that, especially since the Paris meeting, that strides have been made. There have been smaller countries, medium-sized countries that have really taken this seriously. And so I also want to shine a light on that a little bit. Like, what have we learned about the positive steps that have been taken in this interim period between these two major conferences? What do we know is working and can work?
I see. Kyoto, so stepping back a little bit before Paris, Kyoto introduced a mechanism of trading, carbon trading and trading emissions and things like that. So the wealthier countries can continue their industrial way of life, but pay poorer countries to retain their forests and not to go down the industrial road and things like that. I think this kind of carbon trading has had benefits, but it's also permitted the wealthier countries, or the more industrialized countries, the more polluting countries, to not move as rapidly as they could have or should have. South Africa, for example, is one of the highest per capita polluters in the world because of our industrial base. Certainly in Africa, we're the most polluting country, or the country that generates the most greenhouse gases, and we haven't really taken the bull by the horns. We haven't really grasped the thistle or the nettle and said, how do we change that? Some countries, the smaller countries, the less powerful countries, for example, small island nations, they're concerned about global sea level rising, and they're becoming swamped, and they're looking for places to move some of their populations to. You also have a fairly strong coalition at the United Nations of these small island nations. You have about 40 or 50 nations that have come into a coalition which wants a higher ambition. So a higher ambition for lower temperature increases. So I mean, at the UN, there are all of these blocks, all of these kind of groups of smaller countries which can actually become quite strong when they start negotiating together. The EU, for example, has, I think, a fairly good record on climate change, or on changing their technology, and they're part of the leaders of kind of alternative technology, alternative forms of transport, moving away from coal, although Germany is very heavily invested in coal still. The EU as a trading bloc, the African Union as a trading bloc or as a negotiating bloc, carry a certain amount of weight at these United Nations meetings. And so the Asia Pacific countries, the Latin American countries, they also come there and they negotiate on behalf of more than just one or two countries, but they negotiate on entire regions of the earth. And I think that's quite powerful.
I don't want to use the language of, success and failure when we're talking about a summit like this, but let me ask you, what do you, hope would come out of this conference in Glasgow, COP26?
I hope that there will be great generosity. I hope that many of the countries who are negotiating there will really have read that IPCC report and have taken it seriously and said, we have to do something. Antonio Guterres at the General Assembly last month said that this is the moment where we really have to go seriously to make changes. I hope that the Paris Accord will be really, really respected, and people won't be withdrawing or retreating from Paris. I think it'd be great if people will be more generous and say, okay, we set our goal at 2 degrees. 1.5 would be ideal, but maybe we can even go less than 1.5. Maybe we can advance our whole timetable, not for 2050, but let's try to go to global net zero, or at least certain countries to go to net zero by 2030 or 2040. So let's accelerate the pace that Paris set for us, so that we'll reach kind of climate neutrality by the end of the century.
I have one more question for you. We talked about the religious and spiritual kind of underpinnings of our approach to this ecological crisis as Catholics, and how Francis has focused on that in his messaging. So this is a kind of a personal spiritual question. What advice do you have for kind of wading through the eco-anxiety and despair that can beset us when we're looking at the crisis? Sometimes, and I know I'm not alone in this, you kind of read the headlines or you read the report that you're mentioning, and you can quickly spiral downward into utter despair and sadness in thinking that we're helpless and that we're, not going to get out of this, and God only knows what's going to happen. So maybe just a spiritual word of advice or guidance on how to wade through that.
I think using Ignatian spirituality, since I'm a Jesuit, despair and anxiety are what Ignatius would call desolation. We're not in a good space. We're not turning towards God. We're not filled with hope. And God is a God of hope. God is a God of salvation. And whatever rabbit God is going to pull out of the hat, or whatever COP is going to pull out of the hat, we have to say, we continue praying, we continue hoping for the best. I think we have to be proactive. I think each of us has to do our little best rather than give up and just feel just completely out of control. We are, to a certain extent, out of control because we're talking about dynamics in the earth and earth sciences, which are so enormous, and they've been going for well over 100 years since the Industrial Revolution. But we have to say, I'm going to do something. I'm going to take some agency, and as a Christian and as a believer, I'm going to start protesting. I'm going to write to my congressman. I'm going to speak to my politicians. I'm going to encourage young people. I'm going to participate in Fridays for Climate or something like that. I'm going to not allow myself to become passive, but I'm going to remain active as a person of faith and a person who believes that God really wants to save us from this crisis. And God wants us to save ourselves from the crisis. God isn't going to do absolutely everything for us. We have to actually get out there and involve ourselves with God's plan of salvation.
And maybe that means cutting back on vacation, on meat, on those little things in our day-to-day life that we often take for granted.
I think that's inevitable. I think we really have to.
Father Peter Knox, thank you very much for joining us and talking through this very complicated and important topic. And thanks for sitting through the thunderstorm there in South Africa to meet with us today.
It's been a great pleasure to be with you, Sebastian. And thank you to our listeners for following us here. And let's pray. Let's pray together for our leaders and for ourselves as we approach COP26, that it may touch us personally as well.
Amen. Thank you, Father Peter.
You're welcome.
Thanks for watching Behind the Story. If you value this kind of conversation from America, be sure to hit the subscribe button and share the video. And please support videos like this by getting a digital subscription to America Magazine. Just go to americamagazine.org/subscribe. The link is below.